God, this is so strange. I really don't do stuff like this, honestly. I'm not even a big internet person. I just don't know what to do. Everyone involved has given up, except me, and this seems to be the only place that provides people with answers. Even in these cases, or a direction to point me in. I found it when my parents were out of town. They lived in the same house my entire life, had both retired from their jobs, and were doing a lot of traveling. During that time, they'd had renovations done on the house. It wasn't a huge surprise when they'd asked me to help when they were gone. Out of the 3 children they had, I was the only one that hadn't followed in their footsteps in the medical field. I made a few too many mistakes at an early age and flunked out of high school. Construction was the only real option, but I'd made somewhat of a name for myself in that field. I owned my own business, and my parents would often hire us out on renovation jobs in exchange for discounted rates. I wouldn't have charged them at all, though, but they still insisted. When it all happened, they announced that they were vacationing to Canada to see Niagara Falls. During the time they planned to be gone, they put together a commission list of all the renovations that they wanted to pay my crew and I to do. We'd worked for a week building a shed and replacing a few counters in the house. Work had gone by fine, and with the job mostly being over, I sent most of the guys home. All that was really left were just personal things my mom had asked me to do. One of those tasks included starting digging a hole for a small koi pond that my mother was planting. I'd been digging for about an hour, I think, and I was enjoying the effort of the task, just kind of zoning out. It's something I did pretty often when I worked alone. Then I started uncovering plastic, like a clear tarp or something. Admittedly, I was still a little zoned out, staring so puzzled at it, before coming to the dawning realization that this didn't seem right. I thought about just going inside, calling my mother's phone, and asking her about it. Surely she'd know if something was buried in her backyard, but I still continued to dig anyways. It had started to get dark by the time I had completely uncovered all of the tarp, which seemed to be buried on top of something. I fumbled for my phone to get it out of my pocket and turned on my flashlight. When I shined it into the hole, it was hard to tell at first. Hell, I had to crawl down into the hole to really take a look to be sure. Under the tarp, there were the remains of at least 2 people. I bet I sounded like a damn fool to the 911 operator, who had to deal with me frantically stumbling over my words, trying to explain that there were fucking skeletons in a hole in my backyard. First, it was the 2 officers that arrived, who mostly seemed like they thought I was joking. Or maybe they thought they'd look into this hole and find the remains of some dead family pet. However, when they saw what I'd seen, they both went pale and called in for all the overwhelming bullshit that came next. Interviews, which I had to defend my family, defend my siblings, and defend myself. Forensics teams sweeping the entire place, moving the bodies. Turns out there were 3 of them, all belonging to children. At a surprisingly quick speed, faster than it all had happened, it was over. Forensics had their job to do. I, nor the police, could get a hold of my parents, so that gave the detectives plenty of motivation to do their jobs. I don't know what else to do, so I just called my sisters and told them the bare minimum of what I could. Just enough to get them out here, but not so much for them to be absolutely freaking out. I barely slept that night, or the night afterwards. Nothing changed and nothing was updated until about 3 days later. They got a DNA match on the set of bones. My DNA. Somehow, one of those tiny skeletons belonged to me. The other 2 tested close to mine, and they were later confirmed to be perfect matches to my sisters. I know how it sounds, trust me. I'm like literally losing my mind, but I'm in so much of a shock that writing all this down has been the only thing keeping me sane these last few days. This is my life, and I'm horrified. After finding out that information, it slowly went off the rails from there. At first, everyone involved tried to tell me it was a lab fluke. Then it was tons of excuses. Told me that they were sending samples to other labs, talking to DNA specialists. They got kind of frantic after that from what I observed. I mean, every expert was stumped. They couldn't understand how the DNA was a perfect match. They compared dental records that matched perfectly as well, and they told us they were looking for someone who might know anything. They told me this for weeks afterwards. I don't know where they found him, but they eventually found someone that I believe might know something. They sat me down with him in one of those tiny interview rooms with the two-way mirrors. They called him Detective Grady. He limped and wore an ill-fitting brown suit and smelled like he bathed in cheap cologne to cover all the smell of cigarettes. And something else that I just couldn't put my finger on it. He was the kind of guy you'd see working at a funeral home, not with the police. Despite his severely off-putting appearance, he was surprisingly easy to talk to. Looking back, the entire interview was incredibly off in some way, but somehow nothing really seemed weird to me at the time. The questions he asked were normal enough, but gave some odd answers I'd never thought about before. Like, for example, he'd ask me about my health throughout my life. It's never crossed my mind, not once, but I've never been sick as far as I remember. No colds, no flus. I don't think I've even vomited unless I drank too much or ate something wrong. The questions were normal, but my answers weren't. I just ended up going home frightened. Somehow, despite never seeing him afterwards, I feel like I've never been out of Detective Grady's presence. It doesn't necessarily feel like I'm being watched, but more like every space I enter is somehow occupied by him as well. I can't explain this feeling. My sisters were also both given similar interviews with the same results. They were both scared. I remember sitting with them in the living room the night after. We agreed that something was obviously off about our childhood, but we just didn't know what. It all feels foggy looking back now. If I think about it too hard, I get painful migraines. At this point, we still hadn't heard from our parents. In fact, no one had. They packed up the car, left the hotel that they were staying at in Canada, and have yet to be seen. I don't want to worry about them, but they are my parents. I'm just afraid that they might know something. I don't want to believe that they had anything to do with this, but they'd never run off like this before. They were caring and loving parents our whole lives. And that's something I'm sure of. Weeks went by with no word from the police or Detective Grady. My sisters and I waited at our parents' home, hoping for some ray of hope. We even talked about seeking outside help on our own on more than once. It's actually where no sleep came up. The girls are both avid readers. Still, we were too afraid to make a move and possibly hurt the investigation we thought was underway. However, a call paid to the police station nearly a month later provided us with horrifying results. Every single detective that had worked on the case had been transferred. No one working at the station had any record of the investigation, and the bones were no longer in their possession. I tried to talk to some of the other employees, but they were all ignorant. Our parents were now listed as missing. That was it. We persisted as much as we could, but with the station giving us absolutely nothing new over time, my sisters and I were just at a loss. It's been a few weeks. Our parents are still missing, and they've heard nothing from the police. My sisters have now gone back to work. Both are now seeking counseling, but no longer want any part in this case. The fact that I've just been so adamant about figuring out the truth has worn down on them, and they don't even want to be around me anymore. I understand, they're scared. I'm scared. I barely sleep and have nothing but nightmares. I can't even go to work. I don't know if this is asking for advice or if I'm just trying to make this known. I know my sisters want to forget, and there's something in my mind screaming at me to forget it as well. In fact, it's screaming so loudly that I'm afraid I might actually forget what I found because of it. Have any of you heard of something like this? What's happening to my family?